Hi, Bob. How you doing today?
Hi, Jim. I'm great. How are you?
Great. What I wanted to talk about today for the audience is the biggest problems encountered with polishing concrete. And then, of course, the questions everyone will want to know or the answers is how to avoid them.
Okay. Yeah. So, in an earlier episode, we talked about what are the most important things to make sure before the concrete pour happens, from the polisher's perspective. We talked about mix design and elevations. And now, in this episode, we're talking about, the biggest problems encountered when the polisher shows up on the job site. So, this picture really says a lot. And one of the challenges, especially if you're working on a national account, is dealing with the other trades. So, you're faced with the guys that are hanging the drywall and the overhead painting contractor painting dry fall. I've seen horrible situations where the schedule is being dictated by the client and the GC, and they're telling the polishing contractor, you've got to move in right now, obviously before racking and sometimes before dry fall paint is even installed. And then they finish the polishing, and the people that are painting the ceilings come in and they don't protect the floors, and the dry fall gets on the floor, and it's an absolute disaster plus an added expense to clean all that up. So this picture is showing that you will be faced with other trades. Now, why can't we all play in the same sandbox? And what I mean by that is we've all got to get along. So the GC is, building a project, they're constructing a project, but they've also got to be cognizant of the fact that, a polisher is often mobilizing from a different state. So at a minimum, they should be turning over half the store, to the polishing contractor so they can finish that first half. And once that's complete, then they can move all the construction materials onto the other half and let them move on.
Smart way to do it.
Yeah, it really is. So, again, on the first episode, we talked about the importance of evaluating the slab. And oftentimes, we talked about, younger polishers, newer generation polishing contractors getting into the business that doesn't really have a concrete background, and they don't know how to evaluate a slab. And then they come in and they try to polish this scenario, what we see. And, the client comes in and says it's not acceptable. And what you're looking at is it's referred to as a differential finish here. So not only around the column, they didn't do a good job of riding the power trowel right up and touching the column. And it results in a much lighter appearance. And even you can see the variation on the concrete slab. You see the high degree of modeling, which is usually an indication that perhaps the slab is getting away from them, or there is some mix design considerations with an oversanded mix. So the polishing contractor really needs to be identifying problems like this. Now, there's usually solutions for it. Cutting deeper is one solution, but you can't compromise going too deep because you're going to expose too much aggregate. So in this scenario, what we would do is we would come up with a color match, a dye wash using a gray dye, and somewhere, right around a 100 grit, you would be applying dye prior to the densification process to tone down that. I call it a hot spot. Painters refer to hot spots with a real bright look, and that's what we have here. So you can tone it down with some color. So this is a classic example of a construction joint, and it gets back. You guys hear me use the term a lot, differential finish. And what happens is, one side of the concrete has not been placed yet, so you have what's referred to as a bulkhead or your formwork, and you either drive the stakes or cut the stakes flush. With the logic being, you want to ride the power trowel right up over the edge of that bulkhead. And when they don't ride the power trowel right up over the edge, the place and finish worker is finishing it by hand. So you've got approximately a 2,000-pound ride-on trowel versus a 180-pound person troweling the concrete, and you'll end up with a much lighter appearance than this. So it's important on industrial floor slabs that are going to get polished that you do as much machine finishing as possible, as close as you can get to the columns. And oftentimes, what the place and finish guys will do is they'll even use a little walk behind, a 2 or 3 foot, edging machine, so it's got the same finish. So again, from the polishing contractor's perspective, it's up to he or she to evaluate this and identify it. When I've worked with other polishing contractors to help them out consulting, I'll tell them to get a foundation plan that shows the saw cuts, or a A1 floor finish plan, and mark up all these problem areas and identify the areas before it's too late. Because oftentimes the polishing contractor mobilizes from a different state, they do the polishing, and all of these imperfections that we're looking at here don't go away. So you
Is
got to be
there a fix on this, Bob?
yeah, so really the fixes, Jim, are to cut deeper without compromising the exposed aggregate, and then doing a dye wash like the previous picture. So you'd be surprised, you could really work miracles with diluting down grays or black dyes. And sometimes it might require multiple applications, but you can tone that down dramatically for sure.
What do we got here?
So there was a contractor that called me on a store down in South Florida, and they mobilized from a different state, and they started running their grinding equipment, big heavy ride-on machines, and the floor was starting to disintegrate. And this is a classic symptom right here that we refer to as delamination. And he mentioned to the general contractor that he was working for that, look, you've got issues, and they told him you must keep going. And on a project that should have taken, I think they had projected 8 days to finish this 30,000 square foot slab, ended up taking close to a month because they had to grind down through all of the delamination, which ended up giving them an exposed aggregate floor. So, and, the end result was nice. I mean, the client was satisfied; they didn't have to remove and replace concrete, but it did dramatically impact the duration schedule of the project, plus the amount of labor. It's a very laborious process. Now, there's other ways that you can get down through the delamination, such as concrete shavers, even scarifying, sometimes shot blasting. But when you have that scenario, you must remove all of the failing weak layer of paste that's delaminating, especially in stores where they have heavy traffic with forklifts that has heavy pallets. You've got to get down to sound concrete.
Are there other causes of this than just too much water, bleed water coming to the top, the mix being too wet, or what else would have caused this?
Yeah, so there are several culprits. So you hit it right on the head, though. The number one consideration, Jim, is bleed water being trapped and prematurely finishing the concrete. But yeah, so we've seen a lot of changes through specifically the last couple years with cement replacements, and what it's doing is it's affecting the bleed rates of the concrete, and oftentimes it's unpredictable. Sometimes it sets too fast, sometimes it sets too slow, and it gives the concrete finishing crew a false sense of security, and they don't know, to get on it sooner or later with the pans, and oftentimes it's a result of trapping bleed water. I have seen some issues too with pouring on saturated vapor barriers where it's rained, and if the interior walls and roof has not been constructed, and then they're pouring on standing water, that's going to dramatically affect scenarios like this as well.
I'm curious, Bob, did they get paid for that taking a month versus their 8-day bid? Did they get extra work on this, or did they get stuck with it?
No, it absolutely is not the polisher's fault. So they did submit a change order, and they did get compensated accordingly. I don't know, I didn't get involved with the financials of that. But yes, it's not the polisher's fault. In this, I can't emphasize and stress the importance of the polishing contractor to walk the floor first. Every square foot of that floor, you must walk it with your floor plan and identify, all of the photos that we've looked at so far. You need to identify the problems.
And is that walking with the superintendent or an owner's rep?
Preferably, yes. Preferably, yes.
Good advice.
Wow, that pretty much sums it up right there. So this is what we refer to as curling, and that's very, very dramatic curl that you see right there. And there's a lot of influences or factors that influence curl. So it could get back to the mix design and the amount of shrinkage. If it's poured on top of a vapor barrier, at construction joints, the way that the reinforcing steel passes through the construction joints can affect curl, and site conditions like ambient temperatures, humidity, all of these things can affect curl. But getting back to, from the polisher's perspective, you know what's going to happen if they just run their power trowel and or their walk behind planetary grinder over that. You're going to have exposed aggregates, right at the joints. And what if the client's not wanting that? So it all ties back into walking the floor. I mean, that's when I'm out on a job site, I literally will try to go find a straight edge for this reason right here and identify any potential problems.
And that's so out of level there that they're going to have to learn to like exposed aggregate at the joint, right?
Yeah. So if you've got a very experienced polishing contractor, there are some things that can be done. Like if you can imagine running your grinder parallel with the joint, as opposed to straight over it. In other words, run it at a different angle than what you see the metal straight edge there. So run it parallel with the joint, barely overlapping it. So you're trying to transition out the high spot. So an experienced polisher can minimize the amount of exposed aggregate, but on something that severe right there, you're still going to expect exposed aggregate on the high spots.
That's a smart idea. I hadn't thought of that. Good call.
Yeah, and
So
another thing, Jim, this gets back to the first episode that we did with regard to mix design. If we know that a slab is being polished, oftentimes we'll assign specified FF, which stands for floor flatness, and FL, which stands for floor levelness, measurements to the floor. And so we have certain standards knowing that the slab is going to be polished. For example, an FF 50 and an FL of 35 is a standard specification, knowing that we're going to either do a cream finish, a class A, or a salt and pepper class B finish. And oftentimes, if those measurables have not been met with regard to the floor flatness and floor levelness, right out in the middle of a slab, you can have a big pocket of exposed aggregate. So, and from the polisher's perspective, especially on a commercial account, you might even want to request if the floor has been tested for the floor flatness and levelness. And if so, can you see a copy of that report so you know what to expect?
good point. And based on my shopping experience on some of the polished floors, they definitely are running into these issues because you'll see
Yeah.
different levels of exposure quite regularly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And it's kind of ironic in terms of your shopping experience. Those pores, which typically are in the 25,000 footprint square foot range, are the most challenging pores because of all of the penetrations and it's tight quarters, and oftentimes they have to buggy the concrete. And I can see when a slab has been buggied versus tailgated right out of the back of the truck, because generally you'll see about every 3 or 4 feet pockets of aggregate. Because what happens is during the transit of the concrete being transported in the buggy, the aggregate, which it starts to settle to the bottom of the buggy, and then when it's dumped, now you've got that coarse aggregate at the top of the dump pile of concrete. And if they don't pro vibrate that, you've got that weak or thin layer of paste right there, and you can literally see every 3 4 feet where the buggy dropped the concrete.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for this, Bob. And that beautiful property that you have in Georgia, where you live with your wife, Leanne, what's going on there? How's that lake looking?
It's actually looking beautiful right now as we speak. However, in 2 days, I think we're going to get the remnants potentially of a Category 1 hurricane, which typically fizzles out by the time it gets up here to our place in Temple, Georgia. But we continue to do what we do and have R&D and an occasional class here and there, and so it's shaping up real nice.
Beautiful. We'll talk to you until next time, Bob. Take care.
You got it, Jim. Thanks.